We are in Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 11. Mark 14, 1 through 11. And as we come to Mark 14, a couple of things to take note. Mark 14 is the longest chapter in Mark's gospel. It records a number of different and important events that will ultimately lead into the coming chapter to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Again, his work on the cross for our sin. Much like the whole of Mark, this chapter will highlight interactions and conversations between Jesus and certain individuals and groups of people. And in these encounters, the individuals will be challenged by what their response to Jesus is. If you recall the last few chapters that we have looked at, really the whole of Mark's gospel so far, Jesus has said some pretty hard things. It begins with the consistent message that he must die, something that he's mentioned 3 times to the disciples, and they've struggled to grasp that and to understand that. We think about just the last couple of weeks of study for us as we've seen Jesus spending time in Jerusalem for this week of Passover, and he's really exposed the heart of sinful man. He's talked about the manipulation of pure religion by the religious leaders and really a way to sort of fit man's inward and self-focus. This has caused a lot of tension between Jesus and the religious leaders. Last week, we looked at his answer to why the temple would be destroyed, what will happen in the last days. And really for the disciples, there is preparation and for suffering and persecution that lie ahead, as well as a description of the end of the age, a time of severe tribulation. Again, all of these difficult and challenging things for people to hear. But along with these hard sayings and sort of poignant teachings, there have been examples of individuals who hear Jesus and take to heart his message. This was evident in the demon-possessed man at the beginning of Mark's gospel, who, after being changed and transformed, he longed to follow after Jesus, to live life with him, but was rather sent as the first missionary with the good news of the gospel into the region of 10 cities, and he does just that. There was the Syrophoenician woman and the woman with the issue of blood who stepped out in faith and approached Jesus in a very countercultural way. We don't know his final heart response, but there was the openness of the scribe from just 2 weeks ago who asked Jesus about the greatest commandment. Obviously, a heart open to the teachings of Christ. And as we look at these examples, both the ones that sort of push up against the teachings of Jesus and those who respond positively, we notice that there really are only 2 responses to Jesus. 2 responses to who he is and to what he says: devotion or rejection. Devotion or rejection. There is either a response of faith or a response of refusal. And as we come to another passage stuck right into the middle of the Passion Week, we will once again see these 2 kinds of responses. And responses that will hopefully draw us this morning to consider our response to Jesus Christ. And then also to expose the dangers of rejection and the delight of devotion. The first 11 verses of Mark 14 are kind of like a sandwich. I like food, I like to eat, so I figure a sandwich is a good illustration here. But the first 2 verses and the last 2 verses, so verses 1 and 2 and verses 10 and 11, are sort of like the bread. And they sort of highlight the rejection of Jesus. But then stuck right in the middle, sort of the filling, is the example of devotion. And for our time today, we want to spend time looking at both of those. We will begin by looking at the response of rejection, that bread of the sandwich, but then move to the filling, the middle part, and spend more time looking at lives changed by Jesus. lives that are devoted to the Lord. In each section, we're going to look at three things. Now, if you're taking notes, our two main subheadings are rejection and devotion. And underneath those, we will find these three considerations: who is involved, what they did, and what we can expect from that response. Who they are, what they did, and what we can expect from that response. Well, let's begin by looking at the rejection of Jesus. Look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 14. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, not during the feast let there be an uproar from the people. Are you at all surprised at who we meet in these first two verses? Once again, it's the religious leaders. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, they have been a constant presence in his ministry. They've questioned his teaching. They've challenged his authority. They've sought to destroy him, and this has not changed. In fact, after the last few encounters, it seems that this endeavor has really intensified. They're looking for the most opportune time to arrest and to kill Jesus. Their rejection of him is clear and bold. But as we look at this passage, these aren't the only bad actors in Mark 14. Look down at verses 10 and 11. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priest in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him, that is, to betray Jesus. This is the second time in Mark's gospel that we meet Judas Iscariot. The first time, he's mentioned back in Mark chapter 3, verse 19, as Jesus is calling his disciples, and all we get in that verse is his name and the reference to the fact that he will be the one to betray Jesus. But here, in Mark 14, we begin to see the heart of Judas exposed. A heart of ultimate rejection of Jesus, even though he is someone who he's walked with and lived with for 3 years. Someone that he's been taught from. Someone that he's served with. Someone who he's been sent out by. But here, that betrayal spoken of in chapter 3 is detailed. And it's interesting to note that Judas seeks out the religious leaders in this passage. Judas will strike a deal with the enemies of Jesus. So as we look at these two examples of hearts turned inwards, hearts of rejection, what can we expect from turning away from the good news, from turning away from God? We'll look at verses 2 and 11. And we see that hearts of rejection lead to self-focused action. Hearts of rejection lead to self-focused action. To say it another way, refusing to worship the one true God leads to worshiping self. And that's what we see in both cases here. Refusing to worship God leads to worshiping self. The reality is we are all worshipers. We all worship something or someone. And in reality, there are only two options. We either worship God or we worship self. Yes, we may have a whole host of idols, of things that we bow down before, that we worship and adore, but all they do is feed the worship of self. And that's what we see here in the examples of the religious leaders and Judas. Self-focused action highlighting self-worship. This is seen as what would be most convenient for the religious leaders would be to just get rid of Jesus. Think about Jesus and his interaction with these religious leaders. All he's been doing is exposing their sinful hearts, calling out their man-made religion, which expands their egos and lines their pockets. It is time to get rid of this guy. And we see their self-focus even more deeply in that decision. I mean, Jerusalem at this day, as we see here in verse 2, is packed with people. The Passover celebration, the week-long feast is just a couple days away. And the crowds obviously have heard of Jesus. Many of them have probably listened to his teaching over the last 3 years. They've been witnesses to his miracles. They've observed maybe the confrontations over the last couple of days. If we turn back in our Bibles, to chapter 11, Jesus is popular. A triumphal entry reminding us and displaying that. And these men know that if they try something public in this moment, it's going to backfire on them. Their reputation and their authority will be on very shaky ground. And so what do they decide to do? They're going to proceed with stealth, but without consideration of who stands before them. In reality, they want to be the hero of their story. Likewise, Judas is clearly self-centered in his actions. Again, it's interesting to note that he's the one that goes looking for the religious leaders. They don't seek him out, he seeks them out. He takes the initiative to betray Jesus, and it seems as if this is ruled by his love of money. In verse 11, they promise to give him money. John chapter 12 tells us that Judas is the treasurer for the disciples and for Jesus, for this group of men. And John 12 tells us that in that role that Judas would often steal from the money. His heart was set on what he could get out of Jesus, how he could use Jesus for his selfish desires. In Matthew's record of this account that we have in Mark 14, we are told that this amount that the religious leaders pay to Judas is 30 pieces of silver. Essentially, it's the cost for a slave. And again, it highlights even more the self-focus of Judas. And these are really two sad illustrations. Two sad examples of people who stood and listened to Jesus, who lived with him, who served alongside him, who watched him minister, and yet they reject him. And notice how this rejection is not one that just leads to apathy. This is not just a mere no thank you. But this is a harsh and bold refusal. We've seen this truth before in Mark's gospel, that there is no middle ground. Right? What did Jesus say earlier in his ministry? You're either for or against. And being against, rejecting, leads to self-focused action, to worship of self over worship of the one true God. And in the case of Judas, it is using Jesus to get what I want, while ignoring the reality that Jesus gives what we truly need. As we look at these two examples, we ask the question this morning, what is your response to Jesus? Is it one of rejection? Is it one evidenced by self-focused action and worship of me? If so, can I encourage you to take time to consider the examples of these men? To continue to track with us over the next couple of weeks as we see the fallout of that decision. Well, in contrast to this, we turn to verses 3 through 9, to the filling of the sandwich. And here we meet two individuals whose response to Jesus is one of devotion. And just sort of as a side note, as we read this text, notice the ordinary setting of this extraordinary moment. It's a great encouragement to us this morning as we live ordinary lives. Verse 3, and while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." As we see here, there's a number of people gathered in a home for a meal. But in the text, two individuals stand out who demonstrate a heart of devotion to the Lord. The first is Simon the leper, a man whose house everyone is gathered in. Now, Simon doesn't get a whole lot of attention in this passage, and we really don't know a whole lot else about him. But he is obviously devoted to the Lord Jesus. As we see here, it's probable that Jesus had healed him from leprosy, given his title there, Simon the leper. Leprosy in that day was a disease that was untreatable and curable. And upon being diagnosed with leprosy, one was immediately cut off from society, cut off from family life, and would spend the rest of his days living amongst other lepers. But here we see, interestingly, that he is at the center of a social gathering. He's no longer facing this dire situation. So maybe he could be the leper of chapter 1 of Mark's Gospel. Remember that man who could not keep his mouth quiet about what had happened to him. Maybe he's the one leper out of 10 who returned to Jesus to worship him. We don't know the specifics, but we do know that he loved the Lord Jesus. And whether Jesus had healed him of his leprosy or not, in some way, this man's life has been changed by knowing Jesus. And so he does what is most natural. He hosts Jesus and his followers in his home. From this example, we see that devotion to the Lord leads to hospitable and welcoming life. The dramatic change of this man, the amazing work of the Lord in his heart, leads him to sharing what he has with others. In this case, with Jesus himself and his followers. Now, Simon, he is introduced in the first half of the verse very quickly, but then the focus shifts and we meet a woman who enters the room. And the rest of the chapter is, or the rest of the section is about her and Jesus. In Mark's record, the woman remains unnamed, but in John's gospel, we are told that this is indeed Mary. Mary, who is the sister of Martha and Lazarus. And some believe that because Jesus is said to have already been staying with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, that Simon is actually the father of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, which could explain her presence in this home. And again, we don't know that, but many speculate that that is the case. And whether it is or not, Mary does something very unusual and very countercultural in this account. She enters the room. A room in a setting where the only reason a woman would enter was to serve food, which she obviously is not doing here. And in doing so, she is exemplifying the dramatic change of heart of a true believer. She is exemplifying devotion to the Lord. And we also notice that she will experience the Lord's welcome. Her devotion is seen first by the acts of just entering the room. Mary does not care what others think. Mary wants to be near Jesus. She'll do whatever it takes to be near him, to listen to him, to show her love and devotion to the Lord, even if that means breaking cultural norms. And as I think about this is probably something we all struggle with at times. And it's not just unique to our day and culture, but probably all Christians struggle with this, being concerned about what others think of our faith and practice. Now, it doesn't mean that we should be obnoxious, in your face, but Mary's example should cause us to consider whether we love to talk about Jesus, to recognize his goodness to us, even in public. Secondly, her devotion is demonstrated in the giving of an extravagant gift. She comes into the room. We read that she anoints Jesus with an expensive ointment or a perfume. An act that displayed her one love for Jesus, and also, as Jesus mentions in verse 8, her understanding, at least to some degree, of his coming sacrifice. What we have here is both an act of care and love, as well as an act of thanksgiving. Notice the expense that is spent here. Nothing is spared. The bottle itself would have been extremely costly. Based on the description, an alabaster vase. This is an Egyptian marble. Would have had a very slender, slim neck to let out just a small amount of perfume. The reason for that is this perfume is very costly. It's something that would have come from India and was undiluted. It was in its purest form. Most likely, this was a family heirloom. It was meant to be passed down from generation to generation and used sparingly. It's a little bit of perfume for those few special moments in life. Could have even been used as an investment. We're told in verse 5 that it was valued at 300 denarii. This is about a year's salary for the average worker. It's a lot of money. But notice what she does. She breaks the bottle. She pours out its entire content. She holds nothing back. She gives to Jesus what is most precious to her and probably what gives her, as a woman in that day, the most financial security. She does so because she knows who he is. And she recognizes what he will do for her. Well, as before, she responds to Jesus. But unlike before, this is a response of devotion. And because of that, there are some things that we can expect. And these are things that are true for her, and they are things that are true for us today. First, she experienced criticism from others. Look at verse 4. There were some who said indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted?" The disciples, and as John 12 tells us, specifically Judas, is not happy with this show of devotion to Jesus. Judas, remember, he's sort of the treasurer. He's the money man of the group, and he does a quick calculation. He realizes how much money was just given, and he is sad because he can't get his fingers on a portion of that. But deeper, this exposes his heart because he not only demeans the gift and the giver, this woman, but he also demeans Jesus himself. His critique declares Jesus as not worthy of this level of devotion. Now, I don't know about your situation, but I imagine that at some level you have received criticism for your faith and your subsequent practice. I mean, why are you wasting your time this Sunday morning gathered in this room? There's so much better things you could do. Why give your finances to a church or to gospel ministry? Isn't there more exciting ways to spend your money? Why talk about Jesus in a setting and amongst people? And that might mean a loss of job or loss of social standing. Sadly, at times, this can happen in the church. Why give up a high-paying career to go into ministry? I'm sure some of our Grace Baptist mission partners have faced questions of why take their family out of a safe and familiar culture and go somewhere unstable and vastly different. And this woman's example gives us the reason why. Jesus is worth it. He is worth the sacrifice. He is worth laying aside of my wants and desires to delight and know the privilege of serving him and being with him. But the reality is people will always push back against that because devotion to the Lord is opposite of rejection. It is worship of the one true God rather than myself. The second thing that we can expect from the show of devotion is that Jesus will always defend his people. Jesus will defend his people. I love verse 6. Following this calculation and this criticism, which I think Mary may have been left sort of concerned and worried about what the Lord would say. Maybe, in fact, she did waste this perfume. But Jesus, he speaks into and deals with this situation by defending her. Verse 6, leave her alone. He stands up for her. She's not left trying to explain herself or her actions. The Lord knows her heart. He knows her heart of devotion. He knows the heart of Judas, that rejection that is leading others astray. He's going to confront both of those. It begins with the heart of those who criticize her. Why do you trouble her? Stands up for her. Secondly, Jesus delights in what she does. He says, she has done a beautiful thing. This is not a waste, because this is an act of worship to God. The next line section sort of sometimes causes a bit of confusion, almost as if Jesus is showing a lack of care and concern for the poor. But if you do a quick study of the Gospels, you will notice that that's not the case. Jesus is deeply concerned and has deep love for the poor. But what he is doing here is exposing the sinful hearts of the critics. They, and particularly Judas, say that the money could have been used and given to the poor. But the reality is that is not what lies at the heart of Judas. Jesus knows that could have been said about all the money he had already stolen. Could have been true of the amount that he was hoping to get out of the sale of this perfume. And really what Jesus is doing here is drawing everyone back to the greatest commandment spoken of just a few days earlier. Love the Lord your God. And secondly, to love others. And the reality is you cannot truly love others if you do not love the Lord. And that is the big contrast here with Mary. It's actually very similar to what we saw with the poor widow just a few weeks ago. A love for the Lord drives a show of love for others. She is demonstrating a true love, and in that the Lord delights, and he will use it for the good of his people. Thirdly, he used what she did. Not only does he stand up for her, but he uses what she did. We're not sure how much Mary understood about Jesus' upcoming death, but it seems that at least to some degree, she grasped some of it, probably even more than the disciples did. And as that day will unfold, as we'll see in the coming weeks, Jesus will not get the proper Jewish burial, but her act here points to and anticipates and prepares for his work on the cross. I want to step back for a moment and just consider the words of Mark 12:44. You don't have to turn there. This is where Jesus speaks of that poor widow who gave her 2 coins, who gave all that she had. And in the original language, both that passage, Mark 12:44 and Mark 14:8, where Jesus says she has done what she could, the wordings are almost identical in the original language. The poor widow, in Mark 12, gave a small offering. Mary in Mark 14 gives an extremely expensive gift. But what we notice with these two accounts is because they were given from a heart of love and devotion to the Lord, he commends both of them equally. The wonderful truth for us is that in both of these examples is that the Lord delights in using what we give. If it is given out of a heart of love and devotion to him. Doesn't matter the amount. Well, the fourth thing that we can expect that we see here is that the Lord commends her as an example. Verse 9 is an astounding promise. Wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Do you realize that just by reading that verse here, in that moment, that we are a part of fulfilling that promise 2,000 years later? But this is not just some reward for doing what is right. It's not the hall of fame of gift givers. The Lord is using what she did as an example for his people throughout the ages. An example of giving from a heart of devotion, not caring what others think, and knowing that the Lord defends his people and uses their gift. And that, yes, Jesus is worth it. As we come to a close this morning, we can't help but see the contrast between these two responses to Jesus, that response of devotion and that response of rejection. And as we look in on these verses, they should really challenge us to consider our hearts and our response. In the coming pages, we will see the devastating consequences of rejection. Judas will lead the religious leaders to Jesus. His life will ultimately be destroyed because of his self-worship. And that should cause us to ask ourselves the question, do I use Jesus merely for what I can get out of him? For some, maybe that use is not overtly refusal, but merely selfish gain, even practiced in the church. How can Jesus' teaching help me live the good life now without having to deal with all that faith and trust stuff? How can I participate in religious ritual to build myself up, to make myself feel good? For others, Jesus is like a punching bag. Destroying him serves to elevate me. Either way, rejection is rejection, and it is serious. But Mary's response here points out that Jesus gives us what we actually need. And when our faith and trust is placed in him, when our worship is directed to the one true God, delight and joy overflow. And there is peace and in true happiness and a longing to be with Jesus no matter what. As we have asked every week, an important question, who do you say Jesus is? It's important because it's an eternal question, and here that question is expanded. How do I respond to Jesus? How do I respond to Jesus? And we see here in these examples, there is no middle ground. I either worship God or I worship myself. The question for each one of us this morning is, who do we worship? Who do we worship? And that too is important to consider because it is impactful for all eternity.